All right, we're back here for Casthammer episode number 2. Loremaster of Sotek and I are going to be exploring a different subject here today. We're not going to be talking about Warhammer Fantasy lore, nor Warhammer 40k lore. Today, we're going to talk about Age of Sigmar. So before we get things going here, I want to give a quick shout out and a special thanks to H for Havoc. He made the new thumbnail that we have and the picture you're watching as you watch this this lovely podcast. Hey, this is pretty sick little picture, isn't it, Sotek?
Oh yeah, it's beautiful.
He's like, yeah, I can do I can do better with my thumbs. But we will be making some way to have the YouTube version of this podcast be a little bit more enjoyable to watch. We're still kind of working on what we really want to do there, and we'll also be working on how to put the podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes, whatever makes the most sense. It'll always be on YouTube. We should be able to find those other platforms as well. But today's topic is going to be getting started in Age of Sigmar's tabletop. Like how to pick up some models, how to really kind of get started in playing. And this is a subject that Sotek and I feel is pretty important because a lot of people have started to make that transition to Age of Sigmar. There's a lot of really fun things coming with Age of Sigmar's 2.0. I mean, in your opinion, Sotek, do you think Age of Sigmar 2.0 is in a great place? Or it still needs some work?
No, I would say it's in a pretty awesome place right now. Like, it's a good time to get involved.
And I think that's like I'd say it's very contrary to Age of Sigmar 1.0, where it was...
Yeah, don't talk to me about first edition.
We don't go there. But first edition was pretty bumpy. So what we're going to talk about is, again, my knowledge of Age of Sigmar is limited to the scant amount of lore I've looked into. Armies I've kind of looked at picking up and like the competitive portions of those armies, like Stormcaster Eternals. So I'm going to play the role pretty much of you guys, the newer Age of Sigmar viewer who wants to find out more about the hobby, how to break into it, so on and so forth. And Sotek is going to play the aged Age of Sigmar veteran who's weathered the storm of first edition and can kind of help us break into it. So let's start off with just talking about 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy. And getting into 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy was, for the most part, pretty easy. You'd pretty much select an army, you'd buy the army book, you'd get a hold of the rules, and in the 8th edition of both 7th edition of Warhammer 40k and 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy, you could buy a smaller, like, booklet form, a paperback version of the rules. And it was awesome. It was like everything you needed to get going. It wasn't the $120 tomes of the earlier editions that you had to like really crack into. But pretty much once you got the rule book, you got the army book, you really only needed to buy like 2 troop choices. Or, I'm sorry, 2 core unit choices. Like for instance, High Elves needed to buy 2 units of Spearmen, and then maybe a Prince box, and you pretty much had the base necessities to get going. You needed more, obviously, from there, but once you had that, you were good. And even if you wanted to play High Elves or Skaven, you could split the starter sets with someone and say, hey, I'll buy one half, you buy the other, and I'll take the rule book if you don't want it. Because a lot of people were buying those for just the unique models. But that's 8th edition Fantasy. Pretty easy, a little convoluted when it came to actually expanding your army, but how does that compare to Age of Sigmar? How would you say, I guess, getting into it really works, Sotek?
Yeah, so some of the big differences between the two is that the first big difference that I would want to draw between Age of Sigmar tabletop and Fantasy 8th edition tabletop is that Age of Sigmar tabletop is a lot cheaper to get into. Because although in Fantasy it's technically true that you could just get away with like the shortened rule book, the army book, and then pick up just a couple of units. If you wanted to play like at your local hobby, if you wanted to actually play the game, you needed a pretty substantial amount of models.
Right. And investment too, like across everything.
Yeah, like it was not unusual for most armies to be running anywhere from like the average army would run close to 100 models on the tabletop. between like all of their cheap infantry to make up their core percentage and all that other stuff. And that's just not the case in Age of Sigmar. Age of Sigmar does have horde armies for people who just like to have a lot of bodies on the field, but they're more rare. And whereas in Fantasy, they were practically required because Games Workshop purposefully shaped the rules so whoever had the most models in a unit would usually be ahead.
Right. That's why Legion, or what, Hordes or Legion? What was it called?
It was Horde rules, but they were called Hordes, and they had a rule called oh gosh, I can't remember. It wasn't Stand Your Ground. It was like I don't remember it off the top of my head, but essentially, if you had more ranks than your opponent did, your leadership wouldn't change.
Right.
Even if you got the crud beat out of you. So, like, it was, but to have a horde, you had to have at least 40 models in a unit, and you would have to have multiples of them most of the time, in addition to like monsters and stuff. So it was just insane.
Right.
Age of Sigmar is not that. Like, even the most numerous armies do not run nearly that many models anymore.
Yeah, I was going to say, even the Horde army of Age of Sigmar is like 50, 60 models big at most, maybe?
Yeah, it's like, if your goal was to run numbers, then you could end up running probably a 100 count model at competitive points, but you would have to take, like, Skaven. Right, and you would have to not take any big things. You would only have to, you would have to spam infantry. But in any event, getting into Age of Sigmar I actually think is a lot easier, because when you're taking your first baby steps into the setting, literally the only thing you need is your army book, some models, and that's it. Like, that's because the basic core rules are completely free.
Right.
Which, if you download any of the Age of Sigmar apps, or which Games Workshop has like 2 or 3 of them now, which, because one's like painting focused, one's focused around like, and you don't even need your book, honestly.
Yeah, the War Scroll Builder, right? That's what it's called?
Yeah, because if you go on the website or you download the War Scroll Builder app, it lets you look at every single unit and you can read all of their rules for free. So you can like learn about every model before you think about what you want to pick up and stuff. The only stuff hidden away in the army books are rules where it's like what kind of items you can take, or if you run certain models together, if they get like a bonus army wide. But even those, I never said this, but you can easily find those on the 1v4chan, because they just flat out put them on there.
Yeah, I think that's like the big thing too. Like when you take a look at okay, so just talking about, let's just say Stormcaster Eternals compared to High Elves, because High Elves is something I will always know. If I bought 2 boxes of Spearmen, that's 40 total units. If I bought 2 boxes of Liberators, that's 20 total units. Like, just to kind of give you guys an idea of scale. And I mean, Stormcaster Eternals are pretty high point cost models when it comes to actual tabletop mechanics. But even then, like, would you say, what, like a box of Night Haunts there's 15 in one of those little, like the little Wraithy Spirit ones?
There's usually 10 models in a Night Haunt box. But with the one exception of the smallest guys, like for all the other units, 10 models is pretty significant.
Right. And I mean, it's just such a smaller impact, I think. Like when you think about painting 60 or 40 models, it doesn't matter if they're Skaven, which I think are actually pretty easy to paint, or Skeletons, or High Elf Spearmen. It's daunting. You have to do a lot of batch painting, like contrast paints or no contrast paints. That's a pretty like sizable task for someone just starting in the hobby.
Oh yeah. Well, and it's like, oh, okay, you bought 40 High Elf Spearmen. That's literally a single unit.
Yeah.
And that's not even going to take up your core allotment. Like, you're going to need like 2 of those, probably.
You need archers,
and whereas
silver
if you bought those 2 Stormcast boxes, like, you're pretty much ready to go.
Yeah.
You just need like characters.
I think that's such a big thing too, is like on the note of characters, your character determines, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, determines the loadout of your army, or at least the ease of filling out your army. So for example, from what I remember, the Lord Arcanum for the Stormcast means that you get Sequitors as Battleline. Battleline is your compulsory required amount of units you have to take in your army. Or if you're a Lord Celestant, like the guy on the Dracoth for the Stormcast, then you can take Liberators as your battle line. And again, Battleline, you need like what, 2 or 3 Battleline is required, or is it based off a certain amount of points?
It's based on points, just like in fantasy, but it's like if you're playing 1,500 points or below, then you only need 2 Battleline, which is nothing. I mean, that's literally just 2 units. And if you're playing 2,000 points or above, you only need 3. Which, if you're playing 2,000 points, you can fill that out without like even break.
Yeah.
But as for your question about it, it depends on the army. So whenever you select an army, there are what determines what makes up the core of your army, aka battle line, which granted only takes up a small percentage of your force most of the time. Unlike in fantasy where it was required to be a full quarter of your army.
Right.
For most armies, basically the way it works is like if you take their army book and you're running everyone from that army book, then it'll tell you these units are battle line for this army. But sometimes it can change, like in the case of Stormcaster, if you take a certain character and he's your general, then you get like certain kind of units then also become battle line. Or for some factions, most of the books now, because we're almost done with second edition. And when I say almost done, I mean almost all the armies have been updated. Almost all of the second edition armies have sub-factions and like a good number of sub-factions. And even the sub-factions might say that something is battle line that normally isn't. Because Games Workshop really wanted to push the idea of allowing players to really I wouldn't say customize is the right word, but they basically provide you with so many different formats that you can run your army in that it really can change their playstyle depending on what you're doing.
Right. They want you to pretty much soup, as it's called in the ITC world of Warhammer 40,000. Soup together a bunch of different units. Like, okay, if you're playing Chaos, you can play a bunch of different flavors of Chaos. You can play the Blades of Corn?
Yeah. And even just within the Blades of Corn, you've got like the regular Blades of Corn, which are a mortal demon mix. Then you can play pure demons, or you could play pure mortals, or you could like play an army that's purely based on juggernauts, like stuff like that.
Which I think is cool. And I think that's when you take a look at stuff like they're called battalion war scrolls, right?
Yeah, so battalions exist in every book, and they're not like in 40K, because in 40K, battalions are literally like just what makes up your army. But in Age of Sigmar, what it is our battalions are something you pay extra for that have a requirement to in order to use. So a battalion will say like, okay, in order to run this, like say you're playing Seraphon, which are Blizzardmen, it'll be like, okay, to run this battalion, you need to have 2 units of at least 10 Saurus Warriors, 2 units of at least 5 Cold Ones, and a Carnosaur Lord. And then you also, in addition to that, have to pay the points for it as a part of your army list. But it'll give unique special rules to every part of that formation. So it might say every unit in this formation gets +2 to charge, and whenever they're in combat, they get +1 save. And they just have that rule for the entire game.
Okay, so it's kind of like when you take a when you take a battalion, you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to pay for this special ability to always be active.
Yeah, on the troops that are a part of it. So it's basically like pointing out a part of your army and being like, these guys are like a special task force based on based on what battalion I took for them.
Oh, okay. I thought that if you took the battalion war scroll, it would apply to like your army. I didn't know it applied exclusively. Like, so for instance, it'll say something like, you just explained it, but like something, for example, like, okay, if you bring 3 Star Drakes, you've got the Star War Scroll of the Stormcaster Eternals. So that only applies to those 3 Star Drakes then.
Right. But it does have its advantages. Like it gives you an extra command point, which in fantasy, command points are much less prevalent than they are. Because in 40K, it's you earn a bunch of command points, and then you try and not spend them all over the course of the battle.
Right.
Or like use them when you need them. Excuse me, goodness.
Those damn command points gotcha.
I like breathed in some spit. Edit this part out.
I promise I'm not going to, because it's going to be funnier for everyone else to listen to.
So in fantasy, command points, instead, you generate a command point at the start of every turn. But for every battalion you have, you start the game with an additional one.
Oh.
So, like, if you're running 3 battalions, you start the game with 3 command points, and then every hero phase you get another one. Which some armies want to run a ton of command points, because ours are not like cards you use. It's that characters have the ability to use command points. To use like command ability. But anyway, the coolest thing about battalions, though, if you're playing in competitive, which people that have played competitive Warhammer Fantasy or 40k will appreciate this, is that generally you get an advantage if you finish deploying all your units first to choose like who will take the first turn. Well, in Age of Sigmar, whenever you take a battalion, that entire battalion has the option to all drop at the same time.
Oh.
So if you show up on the table and you've like made all of your army into one battalion, which some armies can do that, then you can literally just be like, 1 drop, I'm done.
Oh, well, of course, then there's the disadvantage that your opponent can now pretty much counterplay.
But I don't think that's as big of a deal in AOS as it was in Fantasy, just because the movement is so less restrictive.
Yeah, it's way more fluid. And for anyone who's never played Age of Sigmar or who has never seen Fantasy, you had blocks of units, and in the older editions, you had to spend movement to wheel a unit in a certain direction. And now it's just you've got free-flowing units that move in the same way as 40k. You move them each one at a time. As long as they keep unit cohesion, they're fine. Right? I'm right in saying that, right?
Yeah. They move as like skirmish formation.
Right. So it's a lot easier for you to like be, okay, someone placed over here. Well, I can conga line this unit to connect to my lords to give them the bubble, or I can get them in cover a lot easier. And that's another big thing too for 40k, or to Age of Sigmar to 40k, which was never really as prevalent in Fantasy, is that the bubbles, quote unquote, in Age of Sigmar work differently. So in 40k, they very rarely will have the text, the entire unit is within 6 inches of the character or lord, or whatever bubble effect it is. Like, for example, captains can allow your units to re-roll their hit roll of 1. So that's any model, any unit that is within 6 inches. It doesn't have to wholly be within 6 inches. In Age of Sigmar, those rules typically have the wording that states that the unit has to wholly be within the 6 inches or X inches of the character, right? That you experience that a lot in Age of Sigmar?
Yeah, AOS, it depends on the army. Some armies tend to favor different styles. Like if you're playing Night Haunts, which is the army that I play competitively, most Night Haunt abilities are, I'd say like 75% are be wholly within X amount of inches of this character. And then the last 25% are just have the unit within, which if it says unit within, it just means at least one model from the unit is within. But there are even some models in the game that have rules that only affect individual models within a certain distance.
Right.
So there can be a lot of like whack variants depending on certain features or systems. But for the most part, it's most armies it's wholly within. Some armies like Nurgle has kind of some older rules, and because of that, they have a lot of just withins, which is super annoying when you're playing against them, but it is what it is.
So if coming over to from 8th edition Fantasy, you picked up Age of Sigmar. What was the learning curve like for you? Did it take you a game or two, or were you pretty much like mid-game, you're like, oh, this all clicks? Like, how fast did you jump into these rules, and how fast did you understand them?
I would say that coming over from 8th edition, the rules at first it will seem like the rules are like stupidly simple, and it's like, oh, this is really, really easy. But not the problem, but the main meat of Age of Sigmar that makes it really complicated is that in Fantasy, all of your rules were in your army book, and it was just a really simple, like, okay, here's the page that has my army rules that I have to remember.
Right.
And like maybe a character will have an ability that affects himself and like maybe the unit he's in. In Age of Sigmar, it's like totally out of control. Every single unit has its own special rules. Every single unit. Because every unit has what's called a war scroll, which on one hand is nice because that means you can just look up what their scroll is and for free, which lets you play with that unit without needing the book. But on the downside, it means that when you're learning to play the army, you literally have to be looking up every unit constantly to remember what special rule they have. And I'm not talking about like just that they have different stat lines. I mean literally, like I have a unit. So like just for an example, in Night Haunts, just looking over my basic units, one of my units has a special rule where if they have more than 10 models, they reroll ones to wound. Then the next unit has a special rule where if they roll 6s to hit, they ignore saves when they deal wounds. And then the next unit rerolls fail to hits if the enemy unit has 5 or more models. And then the next unit rerolls fail to hits if they charge, but can also flee out of combat and charge again. Like it's insane how many different rules there are. And that part was really hard for me for a while. Like I literally, even now, especially when I take a unit or a character that I'm not super familiar with, like especially like special characters, that have like 2 pages worth of rules just for the model, you have to like double check your work a lot. It's not like in fantasy where you can just read your book over once and you're like, okay, I'm good. Yeah. It's like when you have like 15 to 30 different models in your army and every single model has a completely unique rule set, it's kind of a mess. But that's a strength of the setting, in my opinion, because every unit has a different rule set. The way they combo together is completely unique depending on what units you're taking. And that's a lot of the fun of fitting together the puzzle of how you're going to build your army.
Good point. Because it's like when you compare Empire State Troop Spearmen versus High Elf Spearmen, the only thing that makes them different is the actual High Elf army ability. Army special rule, always strike first, and then martial prowess, which allows them to fight in an additional line. That's the only real difference. So unit for unit, like if you were to wipe away the fact that they were High Elves and Empire, they would just simply be the exact same unit. So
yeah. Whereas in Age of Sigmar, it's like if you had High Elf and Empire Spearmen, it'd be like Empire Spearmen, excluding stat changes, in addition to having those like army rule changes. Because yeah, you still have army rules,
right?
So like, they'd probably still have something like that. But then in addition to that, it would be like, oh, the High Elf Spearmen, if they are charged, they reroll ones to hit. Whereas the Empire Spearmen would be like, if they have more than 10 models, then they get a bonus to battle shock checks. Like they function very differently.
Right. So it's Age of Sigmar has easier to understand rules, but there's more of them versus Fantasy, which had, I guess you could say, simple rules as a whole, but there were more nuanced rules, or at least more tedium attached to each and every rule.
I would say that, yeah, Fantasy had less rules overall compared to AOS, but because it applied to everything, it was a lot more daunting to get into at the beginning because you had to know every single rule to play the game.
Right.
Like if there were rules you didn't know, there were like entire phases that you just wouldn't understand what was going on.
Right.
Whereas in Age of Sigmar, literally the only thing you need to know is, okay, this is how far my unit can move. Great. This is how a charge works. Great. This is how I hit. Great. This is how I wound. Great. This is how I save. Great. You're done. But then you start adding on more layers as you're like, okay, here are the rules for all their individual war scrolls. Okay, then here are all the rules. Here are all the bonuses that my characters give if they're within a certain distance of these units. Okay, then here's all the battalion special rules if I run a battalion. Okay, then here's all the sub-faction rules if I'm running a sub-faction. Okay, and then here's all my army-wide rules if I'm running this army. Okay, like it has a lot of layers.
Well, and for anyone listening, don't think that sounds as daunting as it appears.
No, it's really easy. You can pick it up in like 2 games.
Yeah, like Sotek and I had to memorize. Like it's really funny. Like Nick used to talk, or Turn used to talk about like when he was starting 8th edition, and he'd be like, okay, the hit is this and the wound is that. I'm like, how do you know that's their hit? It all depends on their weapon skill, ballistic skill. Also, he's like, oh no, it's just a roll now, because he had played 8th edition 40k before I did. And 8th edition 40K borrows from the system that Age of Sigmar uses, wherein it just shows you your 2 hit. It shows you the number on of the dice you have to roll, or the number of dice you get when you roll the die. It used to be that Sotek and I had to memorize the to hit table and the to wound table, which was based off of your weapon skill and their weapon skill for to hit, and then to wound them, it was your weapon's strength, or I'm sorry, your strength versus their toughness. So
plus your weapon strength.
Yeah, plus your weapon strength. Yeah, Jesus
armor
Christ.
would be like I will say old school Warhammer Fantasy was mathematical.
Yeah, like
there was so much math.
Like we're talking about these layers and layers and layers, but the rule outright tells you have to roll this dice.
Flat out says this.
Yeah. And even so in Age of Sigmar, there's a mechanic called rend, which is the same thing as armor piercing. If you're thinking about it from a Total War perspective, or if you're thinking about it from Warhammer 40K or Warhammer Fantasy old 8th edition perspective. But it outright says -2. It's just, okay, well, now I know that my roll for my armor save is -2 now. If I have a 3-up save, now it's a 5-up save. Like it's way less like guesswork and assuming that you're gonna, like, you know how your unit's gonna perform out the gate because you know you're to hit. And okay, I know that like the majority of things have a wound characteristic like this, and this, so I know I'll probably be able to get this many hits through. Like it's way easier, I think, to build an army in Age of Sigmar than it was in 8th edition Fantasy, because you had so many like wild cards and so many units that were lackluster. Like, again, I keep jumping back on High Elves because it's the one I played the most competitively. People would bring Phoenix Guard. People would bring Spearmen because Spearmen were amazing. People would rarely really bring Archers. Eagle Claw Repeater Bolt Throwers were alright, but they would use Phoenixes all the time. They would use Archmages. But there's so many units in the High Elf book that you just kind of really were not that useful. And I think that that's one of the strengths of Age of Sigmar, not including Stormcaster Eternals, is there's not a lot of roster bloat. And do you feel that same way?
Yeah, most of the rosters are very condensed in that like the only ones that have like a massive model selection are usually because they have carryovers from Fantasy. But even then, most of those have been slowly getting phased out.
Right.
Yeah, I would agree that the Stormcast book is probably the only new AOS book that is bloated. And that's just because they've had 3 books that have been combined into each other every time.
And they're kind of like the big centerpiece,
Excuse me, they have 4 books
that
got combined into each other. Because you had basic Stormcast, then you had Varangard, then you had the Excelsior, and then you had the Arcanum. So yeah. So Stormcasts are kind of ridiculous. Like Stormcasts are basically what the Empire was in Warhammer Fantasy, where they can do anything. Like they literally have a model that can perform any job. But I will say the one big difference between them and the Empire is that the Empire you could literally run as anything, except for you didn't have monsters. But you could run your army as a lead or horde or anything like that. Whereas the Stormcast do have monsters, but they can't run horde armies. Like they're very elite models that tend to have a lot of wounds, pretty high saves, but they can't run like a massive amount of guys.
Okay. And again, that's a symptom of them being, they have multiple wounds. They have, like you said, they've got high armor.
Oh yeah,
they cost a lot.
Don't get me wrong. Like they're a very good army. And if you're like, man, I don't know how I want to play this game, I literally just want to pick up an army, then Stormcast can be a really good starting point for people that have like literally no idea what they're doing.
Yeah, and I was going to say that too. Stormcast is easily the best army to jump into the game with because they're very easy to paint. I mean, you're talking about a single metallic color with 1 or 2 like secondary and tertiary colors. On top of that, they're easy to find on eBay for cheap because people sell the easy to build models from their starter sets. And I think that starting Stormcast, because there are so many different options, you've got a heavy focus on melee, but then you also have a heavy focus on cav. You have a heavy focus on casting, but then you also have a heavy focus on ranged abilities and siege engines. So, and they're one of the few armies that actually has siege engines. Well, quote unquote siege engine, the ballista. So let's not get crazy here. But you get really a sample of everything. You get like the prayer abilities. You get an actual school of magic. You get endless spells. You get cavalry. You get like large, humongous beasts. So any rule that's going to be present in another army, you're going to get a taste of it, at least in some form, in the Stormcast, I feel. So I feel like that's a really like solid starting point if you're just getting into the game.
Yeah, though I will note, like, Age of Sigmar is really well balanced compared to Fantasy. So like, if there's an army you're like, oh, that looks kind of cool, I think I'd like to paint that, or like, oh, that looks, or I like their lore or whatever. Literally, just get that army.
Yeah.
Every army can be played competitive. And now some are a little better at it. Like right now, Zinj is really, really hot, but I mean that'll come and go as new things get released and erratas come out and stuff. I mean, Zinj literally just got nerfed in a errata. Like I will say Games Workshop is a lot better nowadays at actually paying attention to the meta, and like trying to keep an eye on things. So if a book comes out and it's just like completely dominating, they will nerf it like within a month.
Yes.
Now sometimes they miss the mark occasionally, but for the most part, I do not know of a single army where if you pick it up, it's like, oh, just get used to losing. Like you're just gonna suck. Like I literally cannot think of a single army where that's the case.
Well, because on top of it, you can pull from your respective Grand Alliance.
That's true. Yeah, you can pull in allied contingents if you need them.
Right.
But even played pure, like I literally don't think there's a single army that like really struggles. Just because all of them can be customized in so many crazy different ways.
Right. And just to kind of go off of a point that Sotek was making earlier, the Ideneth Deepkin, which are a new army to Age of Sigmar, they've got a total of like 10, maybe 11 kits between all their individual characters and all of their units, so like 4 of their units are split across 2 kits. So one unit can be built one way or another. Same thing with the other unit, like the Namarti Thralls and Namarti Reavers. But when you take a look at Stormcast, I think it's like triple that number because they've got like they've got like the whole ranged archery line. They've got a whole spellcasting line. It just depends on which chamber that the sacrosanct chamber or whatever chamber it kind of corresponds to. But I mean, so we were going to kind of explore how to build out an army, taking a look at some of the stuff that I was interested in. And Ideneth Deepkin were, again, the army I was going to start until they released the Lumineth Realm Lords. And we now know where I will start. So Sotek, if I were to start Ideneth Deepkin, for example, what would you recommend that I buy right out the gate?
So the first thing that anyone should pick up for any army is look if you have a start collecting box. The start collecting boxes are insanely valued, like to a almost staggering point. I mean, looking at the Ideneth Deepkin starter box, you get a character, you get I think 3 of the eel models, and then you get a unit of Namarti Thralls. But when you actually go out and individually price those, it is genuinely staggering how much money you can save.
I'll help you out. It's $130 to buy those all separately.
Yeah, and it's $90 to buy them as the start collecting.
So you save 40 damn bucks.
Yeah, and some are better values than others. Like the Lizardman or the Seraphon starting set, the Carnosaur alone is more expensive than the set. And the set gives you a Carnosaur, 10 Saurus, and 10 Colwyn Riders.
What?
Yeah, like it's bonkers.
That's a $90 set. And just so you guys know, we're not like sponsored by Games Workshop or anything. This is what'd you say?
I said I wish we were.
I know, right? Seriously, like send us all the shit. It is very uncharacteristic. It's really only been the last 4 or 5 years that they've really done this. That they've done these start collecting boxes, and these start collecting boxes have been such a freak value. Like this wasn't present during 8th edition. This was not.
Yeah, we didn't
all.
have these in Fantasy.
Like you had maybe something that would save you $15 or $20, but Some people even recommend buying multiple start collecting boxes because you can just get such a high value out of them.
Yeah, and there are even different versions
Right.
because there are start collecting boxes, but then in addition to that, so going forward with IDNet Deepkin,
Okay.
you look at it and you go, okay, so you need to get the army book. So you're like, okay, I got the army book, and then you get the start collecting box. Okay, I got and you can even buy the army book as a part of the start collecting box, which I don't think saves money, but they advertise it like it does. But whatever.
It's the same. It's the same $30 or $40 savings. You save money. You get the same models to start collecting, and you get the army box or the army book, and it's $130. So
yeah,
basically, the money you save gets you a free army book.
And then you might think, okay, well, where do I go from there? And honestly, it depends. At that point is where you really want to sit down and start experimenting with building your armies.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say you get drawn, like many people do, to the flying badass monsters of the Idoneth, which are probably the most exciting part of the model range.
Absolutely.
You know, the Leviathan, which is the giant flesh-eating turtle, and the eel riders and the shark riders. They have another special set you can get called the Achillean Corpse, which is 260, which I believe actually saves a little bit of money.
So 50, and let me get the price of those other two.
I think it's 115.
Yeah. So
that's
160 plus, so it's 265 for all the models separately. So you save $5, I think.
Yeah, you literally maybe would save on shipping, but they have stuff organized there that you can just get them together in one big shipment. But every army is really interesting in how different it is. So you get the start collecting box, and if you're like, man, I really like these units in the start collecting box, then yeah, Italian's absolutely right. Get another one.
Yeah.
Another one.
Yeah, another one.
But then from there, every faction has different unique things. Some factions have endless spells, which the Idoneth don't yet because they're still waiting on their second edition book.
Right.
But the Idoneth do have a terrain piece. So some armies like the Idoneth have the Gloomtide Shipwreck, which is literally a giant ghost ship that's on the bottom of the ocean. And if you take that, Idoneth have the ability to take that on the battlefield, and it has a ton of special rules that only help them.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to play Idoneth competitively, you really want to pick up the Shipwreck. Plus, it adds a terrain piece to your collection, which is always really nice.
Right.
And then from there, you just look through the book and then pick up the things you want. But for anyone that would be starting, I would probably recommend getting 1 or 2 of the start collecting boxes, and then focus on getting the Shipwreck, and then focus on getting characters and at least 1 Leviathan, because the Leviathans are just badass.
So and I think that it's so much simpler to get into Age of Sigmar that it takes me. I almost think it's a joke. I'm like, okay, yeah, where's the gotcha? Where's okay, I must need something from somewhere else because this is not a full roster. But that's just the way it is. It's just that all the things that they add to this game are very, not minimalist, but I mean, okay, Ossiarch Bone Reapers were one of the newest factions added to the Grand Alliance of Death, which are all awesome looking, but they're very easy to break into. Their units are extremely straightforward.
Oh, and they're freaking. I mean, I will say the Ossiarch Bone Reapers are probably one of the most complicated armies to play, just because they use a completely different rule set than everybody else for some reason. But they are stupidly strong. They're one of the top armies in the game right now.
Oh, because it looks so goddamn cool.
Yeah, probably. But if you're one of those people out there that's like, man, I want to get into the game, but I just want the cheapest army. I don't give a shit. I just want to play cheap Ogre Matra.
Oh, that's right. Because there's you can buy 5 models and you're done, right?
Yeah, literally. The start collecting box gives you 5 models, and that's a 1,000-point army.
Yeah, it's $90 too. That's worth talking about too. Is these boxes you're looking at around 750? Well, I'd say actually 500 to 1,000 points, depending on. Idoneth Deepkin, I think, is just barely 500, but another really good start collecting box is the Stormcast Thunderstrike Brotherhood, which is around 750 points. And just to talk about value, that's $250 worth of models. I will admit, though, that Thunderstrike Brotherhood is understocked, I guess you could say. Not understocked. So you get 3 of the dudes with hammers. What are they called? Retributors, and you get 3 prosecutors, which are the dudes with big cool wings. But I think it is you need 4 liberators to make a unit. I can't remember.
Yeah, that's the case with some of the really old boxes.
Right,
So
exactly.
like for the Stormcast, thankfully that's not the case with most of the boxes. Most of the boxes are purposely designed so you get enough to have the minimum size of all those units.
Right.
I think literally the only exception of the models of the ones they still sell is the Stormcast.
And when you take a look at those start collecting boxes, look at what they come with. Like, for instance, the Stormcaster Eternal Thunderstrike Brotherhood comes with a Lord Relictor, which you cannot get separately. It's the only way to get that model unless you buy it off eBay.
That's something actually worth talking about.
Yeah, that's what I was about to just dive in on. Do it.
Yeah, so but this is actually really pertinent this week because Games Workshop has actually finally done something that people have been begging them to do for a while now, which is that the exclusive hard to get starting box models are now being released individually.
Right.
As they are no longer available as their box set.
Right.
So like if you're a Stormcast player and you want the Lord Relictor, you have to get a starting box that has the Lord Relictor because they haven't released him yet. Or if you're like a Nighthaunt player and you want a Guardian of Souls or a Knight of Shrouds on Ethereal Steed, you have to get the big starter box for 2nd edition because those are the only places to get that model.
Right.
But this edition, 2nd edition, they released like 4 new starting kits that were like Gloomspite Gits versus Sylvaneth, or Skaven versus Flesh Eater Courts, or Austere Bone Reapers versus Ogre Mawtripes. And each one of those boxes had a unique character in it, but they're now all up for pre-order as like a unique model.
For $30. I mean, it's pretty steep, but not that bad.
That's not too bad for a character. And these are also like literally some of the most powerful character models in the game.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're playing these armies, not necessarily for all of them, but like especially if you're playing Flesh Eater Courts or Sylvaneth, you like need those models.
And they're sick too. They're so cool.
Oh yeah, they're beautiful sculpts. But and that's the other thing Age of Sigmar really has on Fantasy is that Age of Sigmar models are way nice.
Oh,
like
man.
It's night and day. Like look, just show on the screen here, Italian, the start collecting Slaves to Darkness box.
You know what's funny is I have
so
that
compare
up
the
right
new
now.
compare the new Chaos Knights and Chaos Warriors to the old ones. It's like literally night and day.
And the cool thing about it too is like they are night and day, but it's the same exact aesthetic. It's as if they took the exact same models and they made them dynamic. They took the knights and they made them look beastly. And the start collecting box for them is a little bit more expensive than normal. It's $135, but that's
the bucket.
Oh, whoops. Yeah,
it's only
$95. I'm drunk. But I mean, you get some pretty beastly models. You get the 5 knights, you get the 10 warriors, and then can you even get that guy separately now? The chaos,
the Lord on Krakadrak? I don't.
Yeah, I think he's. So. Yeah, I think he's relegated exclusively to. I'll search this by unit to that start collecting box. And again, this is what Sotek was saying earlier. There are some units that you can only get through those start collecting boxes, and if you were going to start collecting Slaves of Darkness, that's not a bad box to buy.
No, it's an amazing box. I mean, that thing, it's a really, really solid foundation for. But and there are so many different ways to play all the different armies as well. Like it gets insane.
Man, I don't even think you can buy the new Chaos Knights separately yet.
They're probably waiting for a little bit to send out those kits.
Yeah, same thing with the.
It looks like you can still get the old Chaos Warriors and the old Chaos Knights, but they probably will replace those in the near.
Yeah, they're so sick looking. Oh man, but yeah, those were the 2 armies I was looking at until we saw Lumineth Realm Lords, and I was like, well, I know my future.
Yeah, the Lumineth are going to be pretty popular,
and that's going to be the subject of our next episode when we get to it. But we're going to close this portion. We're going to close this video out by talking about 3 things, and this is again for getting started into Age of Sigmar, and that is the start collecting boxes that we just brought up, versus the starter sets, which we brought up a little bit earlier, versus just buying the rule book. So there are 3 persistent starter sets. Sotek had mentioned the Gloomspite Gits versus the Sylvaneth, or the Osiarch Bone Reapers versus the Ogres. Those were a limited run, and you cannot get those anymore. Am I correct in saying that? You can't get them anymore, right?
Sorry, say that one more time.
You can't get the starter sets that included like the Sylvaneth and the Gloomspite.
Oh yeah, no, those were like super temporary.
Right, and you might be able to find them in a local game store. You'll probably be able to find them on eBay. You'll
if you can find them in a local game store, buy them and put them on eBay, and you will make money.
Yeah, like I was gonna say, you're gonna pay a premium if you go to buy it. So be mindful of that. But those are the only ways to get specific races that you would want to start as part of like a starter set. But other than that, you've got your 3 persistent ones: Soul Wars, Tempest of Souls, and Stormstrike. Tempest of Souls is $160, and you get 33 Night Haunts and 19 Stormcasts. And the funny thing about the Stormcasts, it's actually like a very competitive set of models from what I've looked up. It comes with Lord Arcanums, Knight Incantor, Evocators, Sequitors, and I think also the Ballista. So I've heard like if you want to get started with Stormcast, buy 2 portions.
If you want to get started with Night Haunts, you must get the Soul Wars box.
Yeah, like, what's exclusive for Night Haunts in there? I know you were telling me this before.
So it's the Guardian of Souls, which is the only non-special character wizard in the Night Haunt faction. He's the guy with the big lantern in the back. Mm-hmm. That guy is exclusive to the set, and so is the guy on the horse in the back. And you really want those models if you're going to play Night Haunt. But for a Night Haunt player, this set is like amazing. The only bad thing about this set is that they give you 5 of the guys with halberds and only 4 of the guys with scythes, which if that was flipped, it would literally be a perfect set. Because you can only run the guys with the halberds in groups of 4, and you can only run the guys with the scythes in groups of 5.
Dude, so I bet you it was planned to be that way, and they swapped it at the last minute and didn't like change it over in the actual.
Yeah, it was super obnoxious. But it gives you get 4 characters by running by getting this. Yeah, because you get the Spirit Torment, the Lord Executioner, the Knight of Shrouds on Ethereal Steed, and the Guardian of Souls, and they are like top tier models. Like their rules are so strong. Like I never run a Night Haunt army without a Guardian of Souls and a Spirit Torment. Yeah. But in addition to that, you get 20 Chain Rasps, which is enough to make a horde of them, which is amazing because it costs $40 just to buy 10 of them. Okay. And they're a unit that you want like at least 40 of in your army. So like getting at least one of these helps a lot. But I will note, looking at these, honestly, I would never, ever, ever advise anyone to buy Tempest of Souls or Stormstrike.
But like, just say,
don't even waste your time. Those sets are complete waste of money.
They're aimed at people who like, okay, I maybe want to see how this is. I want to play it with a friend because those things are all.
You know who
color.
They're aimed at? Those are aimed at children who walk into the store and their parents are convinced to buy something for both of them.
Right.
That doesn't cost a lot of money.
Right.
Like that's literally the only reason you should buy.
They're all easy to build and they're colored correspondingly, right? Like the plastic itself is colored. It's not gray.
Yeah. Like the Stormcasts have gold plastic and the Night Haunts have blue plastic, and they're easy to build sets, and they come with dice and a mat so you can put your models on and play on the mat. Like it's literally like it's for children.
Or Sotek
and another thing is don't buy your tools from Games Workshop unless there's a tool they have that you're really into. Like there's a couple tools I have from Games Workshop, but that's more because I like to support my local hobby store so that they don't go out of business. But like clippers, don't buy them from GW. They're gonna charge you an arm and a leg. Whereas you can go to your local hobby store, for like Hobby Lobby or just any hobby store, and get them for like $2. You know, same thing for paintbrushes can be much the same. Rulers, dice. Like if you can, don't buy from Games Workshop.
Actually,
if you don't have to,
I would recommend if you do want to get into painting and you're looking to really hit it hard, buy the paintbrushes at Games Workshop because they're not amazing, but they're decent enough to not worry about messing up. Because
True.
if you really want to get into painting on like a really good and high level, you want really nice sable brushes, which cost like $15 a brush.
And
So,
you could also follow the guides, which are really nice.
Yeah, exactly. Like
their guides are explicitly made so that if you're not if you're not using their stuff, it's really difficult to understand what to do next.
Yeah, and that's actually another big thing too that I'd say Age of Sigmar has above even 40K, 8th edition 40K, is that when you buy any one of these Age of Sigmar battle tomes, it comes with, there's always a really good comprehensive painting portion of those battle tomes, and it's always made me freakishly jealous for any portion of 40K.
The entire Age of Sigmar app has a painting guide for every model in the game.
Right. I mean,
literally every model.
they have like Age of Sigmar's goal was to break people into Games Workshop as a hobby, and I think it did a really awesome job. I don't think that it needed to blow up Warhammer Fantasy to do so, but that's a topic for another day. I think that Age of Sigmar is so approachable on so many levels, from the rules, from painting everything, from even assembling your very first set, that it's just like everything is laid out before you, and you come into Age of Sigmar at a level that if you were to come into 8th edition Fantasy, you wouldn't be there for like a year and a half. Like, you're just way better equipped across all the paints, way better equipped across all the models, and the way that it starts you out, that you can get going like immediately. You can start playing games pretty fast.
And I will say a really important last note is that, especially for people coming from Fantasy or even 40K, Age of Sigmar is very cheap to get into compared to either of those. Just because, unless you're one of those people that like you play Saints of Darkness and you're like, man, I really want Archaon. Well, Archaon's pretty expensive.
Yeah,
like he's a
true
badass model and he's huge and he makes up like half your army, but he's really expensive.
Yes.
But like, if your goal is like, man, I just want to be able to play competitive tabletop, or I want to be able to run an army that I really like, then Age of Sigmar is a really good place to start.
Agreed. I really agreed. On that note, I think we'll go ahead and conclude things. I think the one last thing that Sotek really wanted to bring up was the Age of okay, we talked about the start collecting boxes versus starter sets versus rule books, and we both agree that the starter set only get if it's your very first time jumping into a tabletop board game at all, or if you want to start either the Stormcasts or the Night Haunts. If you don't want to do that, get a start collecting box, get the respective battle tome, and then talk a little bit about that Age of Sigmar gaming book you were bringing up earlier.
Oh yeah. Technically the core rules are free. But when they say that, they literally mean that the core rules are like maybe 4 or 5 pages long. They're very to the point. If you want to play competitive or with most other human beings, you will need to get the gaming book, which it used to be you had to get the General's Handbook, the core rule book, the Forbidden Power rule book, and the Malign Sorceries book. Each one of those being minimum $35 and anywhere up to $80 to $120.
I'm gonna throw up.
But a few months ago, they released what's called the gaming book, which is it's literally a little $35 book that has all the rules. It doesn't have any lore, no painting segments, none of that. It's literally just rules. Mm-hmm. But it's all of the rules from the entire edition in one book. So it's a must-have. Just because, I mean, I'm probably going to pick one up myself pretty soon, just because I'm tired of looking around all of my other books, and it condenses everything into one book, which is really nice. But that's beside the point.
And that's another thing too, I guess, to close us out here before I pull the curtain down, is that anytime you want, if you're not like Sotek and I have to have a physical book. I don't know about you, but like if I have a digital book, I freak out. Like I need to have that physical.
Yeah, I know people who play on like their tablets and shit, but I'm like,
like peasants. You never cracked the spine on a brand new codex or army book and smelled it like it was cocaine for 3.5 months until it goes out. Oh God. Moving on. If you buy the digital version of any codex, any battle tome, any rulebook, it updates when it updates. So, for instance, any rule update for the Blood Angels that's come out, sans an edition jump, it updates the digital version from what I was reading.
That's true. But you could just be like a regular human being and just download the errata onto your phone, and then you just have it.
Yeah, I know, but I was just saying, if people are like, well, why would I ever want to buy the digital version? Well,
you wouldn't.
Yeah, you shouldn't. The core rules, the free core rules, will update to any rule changes. But if you were to buy the Soul Wars starter set, those will technically be out of date rules because they don't put new rule books in those Soul War sets. They're made once and they send them out. Whatever the rules are at the time they send them out, the rules that you're gonna get in that set. So get the gaming book, download the core rules for free, use any of the apps. Like, that's what we recommend.
Yep.
All right, well, on that note, that ends our second episode of the Casthammer. Anything you want to say before we close the video down?
Once again, we were not sponsored.
yeah, let it be known far and wide. We talked about eBay far too much for us to be sponsored. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Make sure you head on over to Loremaster Sotek's channel. We will be trying to get these up on Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, whatever makes the most sense for mediums to put podcasts on. If you want to see it on something in specific, go ahead and let us know. But we will always have these on YouTube every time we upload. That's our primary upload source, as always. We will work on trying to make them more creatively interesting. What? What's up?
I was just saying, yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
yes. Aha.
Indeed.
All right, guys. Well, as always, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one and take care.